That was the sound of the Israeli Knesset being evacuated. Israeli lawmakers were filmed as they left the building during a retaliation missile barrage that targeted Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Those missiles were launched in response to the massive Israeli attacks which damaged civil defense offices and ambulances and residences in Gaza. As of Monday, the latest update showed Palestinian Health Ministry reports of over 2,800 dead Palestinians and more than 10,800 unofficial figures injured as a consequence of Israeli airstrikes. Over the preceding day, 254 Palestinians were killed, the majority of those women and children. In addition, 37 medical professionals, including doctors, nurses, and paramedics, were killed. Israel's military says at least 291 of its soldiers have been killed, and 199 civilians and soldiers are still being held after being kidnapped. Since October 7th, more than 1,300 Israelis have been killed, according to Haaretz, which also reports that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had to take shelter in a bunker in Tel Aviv when missile warning sirens went off during their meeting. Blinken was in Tel Aviv to meet with what's described as Israel's war cabinet. Turkey is reportedly discussing with Hamas the release of civilian hostages. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh and Turkey's Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan held a telephone call about that. They discussed the latest developments in fighting between Israeli and Palestinian forces, as well as the release of civilian hostages held by Hamas. Here in the U.S., on Monday afternoon, nearly 200 Jewish activists from the United States blocked the street in front of the White House to protest the Biden administration's support for Israel's military actions in Gaza. Some carried a banner reading, "Cease Fire." That protest followed a march and rally outside the White House on Sunday that drew thousands.
Netanyahu, you can't hide! Netanyahu, you can't hide! We charge you with genocide! We charge you with genocide!
The U.S. announced that it selected 2,000 soldiers for possible deployment in Israel in anticipation of the ground invasion of Gaza. Washington says the troops were assigned non-combat roles and represent various branches of the U.S. Armed Services. The Pentagon said there are no plans to deploy infantry troops at this time. The U.S. forces are currently stationed in various locations within and outside of the Middle East, including Europe, according to the Wall Street Journal. The exact conditions for potential deployment and eventual destination have not been disclosed. Some observers, however, said that they would be acting as human shields against actions by outside parties such as Iran, Syria, or Lebanon, making it possible that any strike by one of those or another outside party could result in the deaths of U.S. military personnel and, consequently, risk war with the United States. 14 years ago this past May, then-President Barack Obama sat down with then-Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel and held a press conference. President Obama described Israel in this way.
As the only true democracy in the Middle East, it is a source of admiration and inspiration for the American people.
That statement by then-President Obama pretty much reflects the attitude of U.S. officials towards Israel. Each administration has mouthed the words, "the only democracy in the Middle East," when referring to that country. But what does that imply when the government of Israel commits illegal acts? Is the population culpable for those illegal acts in the way that some Israeli officials are holding the entire population of Gaza culpable for the actions of Hamas's military wing? To probe that issue, we spoke with attorney and author Dan Kovalik. We spoke with him via Skype on Monday. Your thoughts, Dan?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it reminds me of a conversation I had with a friend of mine a few years ago. He's a good friend, but we disagree on Israel-Palestine. He's a very hardcore Zionist and kind of when pressed and unable to totally defend Israel's actions, in the world. He said, well, that's all just Netanyahu. He's the problem. It's just Netanyahu. And of course, my response is, well, who elected Netanyahu, right? He's been now the leader of Israel for over 20 years. Israel's only existed for what? A little over 75 years, something like that. Right. That means for like a quarter of Israel's existence, the people of Israel have voted for Netanyahu and others like him into power. So, I mean, you can't just say it's Netanyahu, right? Obviously, he reflects what, in general, the people of Israel want. Now, of course, there are some leftist resistors left in Israel. That should be pointed out. Not that many. There's also some religious Jews who oppose Zionism in Israel, and that needs to be pointed out. But the vast majority of the Israeli people at this point support this right-wing government in Israel and support settlements, illegal settlements, and support really the brutal treatment of the Palestinian people. Now, what does that mean in practice? I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say that legally subjects them to the risk of collective punishment, that somehow that would be justified. But I do think it does make most people in Israel, particularly the settlers, those who live in especially the recent settlements, morally culpable for what's happening. And they just can't blame it on their government. And I've taken that position, by the way, as an American, that, because when you go outside the U.S., a lot of people say, hey, you're an American, but I know you don't represent your government,
Right.
So we don't hold you culpable for what your government's doing. And it's like, well, maybe you give us too much credit because, again, we may not be a thriving democracy, but we have some democratic forms. And the truth is, a government cannot carry out these types of policies without some consent of the people.
Right. If we don't let them, they can't. Right. That's right. In
the same way that, again, I think people recognize today that the German people had culpability for what Hitler did. That in the end, most consented to it. Yeah, there was a resistance, mostly a communist resistance, God bless them. But most Germans consented to what was happening. And that was understood. And I think that has to be understood when it comes to Israeli crimes and U.S. crimes as well. I think we don't get off the hook. None of us do. Look, I mean, my tax dollars go to the U.S. and to its military-industrial complex, and therefore go to Israel because we give $4 billion a year to Israel. Some tiny, tiny portion of that is coming out of my paycheck. And that's just the truth, So I think all of us have to realize the culpability we have for our government's actions.
Enough of us have done our mea culpas for George Bush, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Obama, etc. So there is certainly that aspect to it. Thank you very much, Dan. It's been very helpful speaking with you.
Thank you, Don.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.